Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be taking a look at chapter 28. So as World War II begins to wind down, the United States and the Soviet Union really begin to size each other up. And this confrontation, this muscle flexing, is going to last for the next 50 years, and it's what we're going to call the Cold War. So why exactly does the Cold War happen? There's a myriad of reasons, right? First off, you can look at reasons why the USSR contribute to this problem. One of them is Stalin being incredibly aggressive at the end of World War II. There were certain promises being made. Stalin doesn't follow through with those promises, so there's obviously some tension there. On the flip side, America is just as aggressive, right? They're trying to get countries to like the Soviet Union. We're trying to get countries to like America. We also have the nuclear bomb, which we are constantly threatening people with. So again, it does definitely lead to some tension between the two countries. At the end of the day, both countries are incredibly stubborn. Both countries are unwilling to budge when it comes to kind of giving an inch to the other side and kind of working on compromising situations, which again is why we're going to have the Cold War for the next 50 years. So how exactly does this grow out of the end of World War II? First thing we see is that prior to the end, Stalin had promised that Eastern European countries would get to have self-determination. They would get actual elections. They would get to vote for what type of government their country was going to have. In reality, that is simply not going to happen. Stalin is going to make sure every single Eastern European country is a communist country. He wants a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe, and he's going to make sure he gets that buffer zone. The next thing we see is that even when World War II comes to an end, we start seeing proxy wars in places like Greece, in places like Turkey, where the Soviet Union is backing the communist rebels in those countries. The American and the British are backing the democratic rebels within that country. So again, we really kind of start to have conflict with each other, and that's why we call it a Cold War, right? We're never actually shooting at each other. We just give guns to other people and have them shoot at each other. It's also at this point in time that Truman is going to issue what's called the Truman Doctrine. So again, President Truman, which basically says if your country is having an issue with communism, if communists within your country are trying to overthrow the government, we'll help you out. It doesn't matter where you are, what part of the world, we'll give you money, we'll give you arms. We will make sure if you don't want to be communist, you don't have to be communist. Another thing we see kind of helping with the pressures in Europe is what's called the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan is the U.S.'s idea on how to fix Europe at the end of the world. And again, yes, we do want to fix Europe, and that's all well and good, but what we really want to do is make sure that Europe has a strong economy. A country is less likely to become communist if everyone has a job. If everyone's working, if everyone has money in their pocket, you don't necessarily want to overthrow the government. The government's working. You're happy, right? So we're going to invest $13 billion into Western European countries to make sure that their economies are stable enough that, again, ideally, they're not going to be overthrown by communist rebels. 1947, we also begin using the idea of containment. This idea of stopping communism anywhere in the world. We know where it already exists. It's in the Soviet Union. It's in Eastern Europe. But that's as far as we want it to go. So again, we're going to get involved in conflicts around the world from here on out for the next 50 years, doing anything in our ability to stop communism from spreading. Now, back in Germany at the end of the war, what was agreed is that Germany is going to be divided into 4 zones. So again, the 4 major winners, Britain, France, America, the Soviet Union, each get kind of a sphere of influence within Germany. But there weren't a lot of details there, right? Like, what can you do in your sphere? How can you set your sphere up? How long are you allowed to stay? Like, what are you actually allowed to do? The Soviet Union is going to use their sphere, and they're going to kind of take advantage of it, and they're going to turn it into a communist part of Germany, right? So again, it's going to be East Germany. It's going to be a communist state. And on top of that, Russia completely dismantles 300 plus factories that they find in Germany. And they send all those parts back to Russia, right? So again, Germany has started this war. This is kind of Russia's way of getting some reparations. So again, they're going to take advantage of their sphere within Germany, right? The other 3 zones are eventually merged together, forming an independent federal zone, which again is going to become West Germany. One of the things that the Soviet Union does to kind of show their displeasure with the other 3 countries kind of unifying their zones and turning it into a democratic society is they actually create a blockade of Berlin. And this is where things get a little bit tricky, right? The city of Berlin is completely in the Soviet zone, but the Soviets still have to share half of Berlin. So again, just the eastern part of the city of Berlin, the western part of the city of Berlin is still controlled by the American, British, and French. But again, it is completely surrounded by communist East Germany. All right, so again, it gets a little bit tricky there. But the point is, the Soviet Union says, all right, you're not allowed to drive into that part of Berlin. You're not allowed to drive through our communist zone. You're not allowed to take trains through our communist zone. So now you have this little tiny island of democracy in this giant ocean of communism. Well, the only option to get there is to literally fly goods in. And that's exactly what the Allies are going to do. It's going to be referred to as the Berlin Airlift. And again, every single thing that city needs has to be flown in. All the food for the city, all the energy supplies. At this point, we're still burning coal. Anything like that has to be flowing in. And again, this is around-the-clock flights for months and months and months. All told, there's going to be 500,000 flights in and out of the city of Berlin to make sure that it is supplied with what it needs. Eventually, the Soviet Union realizes that the blockade isn't actually working, and they do eventually give up. Now, by 1949, we see Germany officially divided. We're going to have the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, which is really just a fancy way to say communism. Also in 1949, the Soviet Unions are going to test a nuclear bomb. A couple things about that. One, they're able to develop a nuclear bomb very, very quickly because they stole a bunch of secrets from the Americans. So again, the Soviet Union, really good at stealing things. The other thing is America was able to kind of dictate terms to some extent, like do this or else. We don't have that or else anymore. Anything we threaten to do to the Soviet Union, they can literally turn around and threaten to do to us. So again, it really changes that relationship between the two countries. We can no longer kind of force our hand in these negotiations. In April of 1949, NATO is formed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And basically what it said was, is that any country in this organization, if you are attacked, all the rest of the countries are going to come to your aid. In response to that, by 1955, the Soviet Union creates something called the Warsaw Pact, which says the exact same thing for Eastern European countries. If any of you are attacked, everyone will come to your aid. No one's planning on attacking Eastern European countries, so this is a bit of a moot point. Plus, everyone was forced into signing the Warsaw Pact. People voluntarily joined NATO. Now, we do see the Cold War getting very hot in the Korean Peninsula. At the end of World War II, the peninsula that is Korea was divided in half at the 38th parallel. There was a zone that was controlled by the Russians. There was a zone controlled by the Americans. As you can imagine, the Russian side is turned into a communist state. All right, America tries to create theirs into a democratic state. But again, we're perfectly fine with this division. The problem becomes is that the North Koreans, who are communists, decide they want to unify the country as a communist country, and they cross the 38th parallel. They're also being backed by the communists of China. Again, 1949, China falls to communism. So again, between China, between the support of the Soviet Union, the North Koreans overrun South Korea. The UN, a new organization at that time, backs the South Koreans. Again, this is an unprovoked war. Again, America is going to be the predominant fighting force, but there are soldiers there from around the world. And again, we are there to protect the South Koreans. We push the North Koreans back. It ends in a stalemate, and that's literally where Korea stands today, at the 38th parallel. There is still a communist North and a democratic South, and they're literally still at war with each other. All they did was an armistice. They just agreed to stop shooting. North and South Korea are still technically at war with each other. Now, what we see, though, in Korea really kind of spreads the fear of communism, right? Like, they're obviously willing to attack. They're obviously willing to spread. So we see organizations like CENTO and SITNO, which, again, are organizations designed to stop the spread of communism in Asian and Central American countries. The tensions do cool down a little bit between America and the Soviet Union. Again, there's not the proxy wars. We're kind of, making the idle threats to each other, but there's nothing major. But again, we see the Soviet Union continuing to put down anything that's anti-communist, and Hungary is a great example of this. The citizens of Hungary have an uprising. They try to overthrow the communist regime. Again, Hungary doesn't stop this from happening. The Soviet Union stops this from happening, right? They're in the Soviet Union sphere of influence. The Soviet sends in the troops, and they completely crush this rebellion. Some other things that kind of keep the tension between the two countries. The Soviet Union launched their first intercontinental ballistic missile. So again, now they have even more of an ability to nuke parts of America. They also are the first group to launch a satellite called Sputnik, which again just continues to stoke fears of what the Soviet Union is capable of doing. So what event gets us the closest to an actual World War III between us and the Soviet Union? I would certainly argue it's the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1959, the island of Cuba is taken over by Fidel Castro, who over time definitely becomes more communist and leans towards the Soviet Union. So in 1961, the Soviet Union's like, hey, Fidel, could we put some missiles in your country? And he's like, sure can, buddy. So again, in October of 1961, we identify that the Soviet Union has placed nuclear arms in Cuba aimed at America. And with the range of these missiles, literally every American city could be destroyed within basically 90 seconds. It's all it's going to take from a launch to a detonation. Again, America finds this unacceptable. We make some threats, they make some threats. It does eventually kind of come to a closure here in that the Soviet Union will take their missiles out of Cuba. In exchange, we need to take our missiles out of Turkey. So again, America was a little bit of a hypocrite here, right? We had missiles in Europe that could hit the Soviet Union, but we refused to allow them to have missiles in our hemisphere that could hit us. But again, both sides come to an agreement that they'll take their missiles out if we take our missiles out. Now, the reason why I say this was as close as we get to World War III is it's about a 48-hour window. If the Soviet Union had not agreed to take those missiles out, we were going to attack Cuba. We simply said we could not accept missiles in Cuba, get them out or else. And again, we're about 48 hours from that or else becoming a reality. And if we attacked Cuba, the Soviet Union would have had to responded, and again, that could have certainly have led to World War III. Some other major events that are occurring during this time, we see decolonialization, right? So again, we talked about imperialism and all these things previously. Now we're going to see the reverse of that. Between 1947 and 1962, basically every single British colony that wanted independence was granted their independence. And the continent that's going to be most affected by this is certainly going to be Africa. So again, now you have all of these former European colonies gaining their independence. But again, in many ways, they just become pawns in the greater Cold War game, right? Now you have this new country who you're going to be friends with, right? So the Soviet Union would come in and offer some things. America would come in and offer some things. Again, we're trying to lure them to our side of this Cold War. Now, there are certainly some negative impacts of this going on. You see some European countries not wanting to let go of colonies. For example, the French own Algeria at this point in time. There are over 2 million French people living there, so they don't want to give this up. They consider that genuinely part of France. The Algerians completely disagree, and it really turns into a bloody conflict of guerrilla warfare. And again, France does eventually lose control. You also see in South Africa, where the white minority groups within that country create laws called apartheid to make sure that Africans no longer have rights or legal standing. And again, you're going to see this until the 1990s in that country. Similar situations, again, are occurring around the world. We see in the Middle East, many new countries are gaining their independence as the colonial system falls apart. The major country we see, though, gain their independence at this time is Israel, right? So again, you see this large number of Jewish immigrants leaving Europe and moving into the Middle East post-Holocaust. At that point in time, they say, we need a place that's our own. We need a place where we get to make those rules. And in 1948, they declare their independence as Israel. And again, this is just one group of people declaring their independence. Is this going to work? The answer is yes, but only because America gets involved, right? America says, nope, this is an independent country. We have their back. We supply them militarily. And again, they are going to have to fight several wars over the next 20 years to kind of hang on to that independence. But again, through U.S. military backing, again, we're not necessarily fighting the war for them, but we are certainly supplying them. They're able to win those wars and kind of reestablish establish their presence in the Middle East. In Asia, we see similar things going on. The U.S. grants the Philippines their independence. Britain allows India and Pakistan, which, again, at one point was one country, again, divided based off religious practices. Again, both of those gained their independence. And a lot of India gaining their independence is through the work of Mahatma Gandhi. China, at the end of World War II, also breaks out into a civil war. We kind of talked about the outcome of that. We know the communists are going to win under the leadership of Mao Zedong. But again, we have millions of Chinese people who don't want to live in a communist state. So they jump on ships and go to the island of Taiwan off the coast of China. And that's where things get a little bit tricky, because even still today, Taiwan, the people that live there consider themselves the true democratic Chinese. The communist government of China considers Taiwan their property, and there's still a lot of tension between those two places even still today. All right, back in Europe, what's going on kind of post-World War II? The Soviet Union is able to rebuild their country very quickly. Again, they're definitely the country that's kind of most rocked by World War II as far as destruction, as far as loss of life. One of the ways they're able to do that is genuinely through forced labor, right? Like citizens are assigned a job, you show up to your job every day or else. But again, this does allow their country to regain their economic footing very quickly, allows them to take a lead in the space race. But there are some downsides to that. By the 1970s, the economy is going to crash. Consumers within the country really have no purchasing power. They're literally just making goods to sell elsewhere, right? Like everything being made in the Soviet Union is just being sold someplace else, not even in the Soviet Union, because they literally can't even afford to buy their own stuff. We do eventually see Stalin passing away, and he's replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who does make some changes, right? He ends the forced labor practices. He allows for a little bit more intellectual freedom, reduces the power of the secret police. But again, the economy slows. There's some foreign policy missteps, and Khrushchev is forced out of power by 1964. Many of these countries that found themselves under Soviet control at the end of World War II, we mentioned, are forced into being communist countries. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, all of these places. And again, the economic and living conditions in these countries are really unenjoyable, right? They're very third world, they're second rate. Again, you do see overthrows attempted. We talked about Hungary in 1956. Czechoslovakia is going to have what's called the Velvet Revolution in 1968. Both of these attempts, again, are crushed by the Soviet Union. But again, they're not enjoyable places to live. There really is a have and a have-not situation within Europe at that time. So what's going on kind of in the other half of Europe then? What we see is that France really tries to establish itself as a world leader at this point in time, right? Kind of embarrassed by how World War II went for them. They really want to show how strong they are. They create a nuclear arsenal. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really work, right? They have a very strong economy. They're an important country, but they're never going to be viewed as a world leader in the way that the Soviet Union or the Americans are going to be viewed. West Germany, the democratic half, they're able to be rearmed by 1955. Again, there's a huge concern, right? Do we even give Germans guns, right? Can we even let them have a military? We've seen in the 20th century that 2 times they've gone to war. But the fact of the matter is we're so concerned about communism that it makes sense to have as many soldiers as possible kind of within that NATO realm, which is where West Germany would be. So again, our half of Germany is going to be rearmed by 1955. The economy is incredibly strong. In fact, just that half of Germany by the 1950s is producing more than the entire country of Germany was prior to World War II. Great Britain really has some post-war issues. Their economy tanks, they lose their colonies, and they really start to implement what's considered the first welfare state. And again, this being the idea of the government taking over private industry and using those profits to provide services for people within the country. Again, this is going to expand, it's going to grow and shrink within Great Britain, but it's eventually going to spread to other countries around Europe. Here in America, we continue to grow. We take a lot of those ideas that are implemented under FDR's New Deal, and again, we expand upon those. As the economy grows, the services the government provide grows to as many citizens as possible. We see the growth of labor unions in the country. So again, economically speaking, America sees a boom. We also have, obviously, the baby boom. So again, America is doing very well post-World War II. One of the things, though, that is happening in America is Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, begins what's called the Red Scare. And this all starts because he's giving this speech, and he holds up a document and says, I have the name of hundreds of communists working in the American government. All right, our country is literally being overrun by communists, and you don't even know it. This obviously scares everyone in America. Turns out he doesn't actually have a list. Turns out there aren't really that many communists. There's a handful of people with communist leaning in the U.S. government. But again, it's not a huge number in any way, shape, or form. And it turns out Joseph McCarthy himself might have been taking money from the Communist Party to kind of spout these lies and get people worked up in that fashion. But it's also during this time we get into the 1960s, we do see a push for the civil rights movement and equality within our society. So again, there are some positive things coming about during this time as well. Women in the Western world kind of find themselves in a new spot at the end of World War II, right? Women are far more likely to end up in the workforce. Again, women prior to World War II, if they were working, they were probably unmarried or young. Now that's not necessarily the case. Now you're even likely to see married couples both with jobs. But keep in mind, just because women are in the workforce doesn't mean they're getting equal access to job opportunities, right? There are still specific jobs where we see women-only kind of situations. As far as pop culture and art at this time, we see a major growth here, and America really takes over as the capital of art in the world, right? Kind of going from Paris to New York, and that's really where the art scene is going to be. And one of the art forms that comes about is abstract expressionism. It's incredibly energetic, it's abstract. It's one of those things where you look at and it's literally just a bunch of lines or colors, and it's supposed to make you feel something. So again, that's really kind of the art that comes about at this time. Pop art also emerges in the 1960s. Names like Andy Warhol are obviously closely associated with that. So you kind of think of the Campbell soup labels and things like that. So again, that's what the art world is looking like at this time as well. Have a good day.